When we look back to the very first moments in which human thought turned its gaze toward the question of what it means to be, we find ourselves standing in the dusty streets of ancient Greece, where philosophers were still learning how to ask the right questions. Imagine the Athenian agora, a bustling market of voices, merchants shouting the price of olives, children chasing one another between the marble columns, and in the midst of it all, a small group of men gathered under the shade of a plane tree. One of them, a man from Elea, would become the voice of a radical claim that still reverberates through every metaphysical discussion: being is and non-being is not. That is the austere opening of Parmenides, preserved in the fragments that have survived the ages. He was not merely offering a definition, he was drawing a hard line across the landscape of thought, insisting that the world could not be a place of contradiction. In his poem he writes, "What is, is. What is not, is not." The implication is that change, motion, becoming, everything we experience as flux must be an illusion, a misreading of the senses. Yet even as Parmenides set this unyielding boundary, another voice rose from the same century, a voice that seemed to speak from the riverbank itself. Heraclitus of Ephesus, the weeping philosopher, declared, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and you are not the same man." Here we have a direct counter-argument. The world is not a static block of being, but a river of becoming, a constant process of transformation. Heraclitus famously added, "The path up and down are one and the same," suggesting that opposites are not opposed at all, but interwoven. The tension between these two positions, Parmenides' unchanging, absolute being and Heraclitus' perpetual flux, forms the first great dialectic of ontology. It is a dialectic that forces us to ask, can we have a notion of being that accommodates change, or must we abandon the idea of change altogether? The ancient debate does not resolve neatly. Rather, it opens a space in which later thinkers will try to reconcile the two poles. The next great step in this early ontological journey comes from a man who would later be called the founder of Western philosophy, Plato. Plato inherited the problem of being and becoming, but he chose a different route. In the dialogue Phaedo, he introduces the theory of forms, a bold attempt to separate the world of appearances, what we see, touch, and hear, from a realm of perfect, immutable being. He writes, "The forms are the only true reality. The sensible world is but a shadow, a copy of that reality." For Plato, the objects we encounter in daily life, chairs, trees, even virtues like justice, are merely imperfect copies of their ideal forms, which exist eternally in a non-material realm. The form of beauty, for instance, is not a beautiful painting or a lovely sunset. It is beauty itself, unchanging and perfect. By positing this higher realm, Plato offers a way to preserve Parmenides' insistence on the unchanging nature of true being, while still acknowledging Heraclitus' observation that the sensory world is in constant motion. Plato's student Aristotle would take a different tack, refusing to accept a separate world of forms. In his Metaphysics, he introduces the concept of substance, or ousia, as the primary being. He writes, "Substance is that which is neither predicated of a subject nor present in a subject. It is that which underlies all other categories." For Aristotle, the reality of a thing is a unity of form and matter. A bronze statue, for example, is not merely the shape of the statue, the form, nor merely the bronze, the matter, but the composite of both. This leads him to articulate the famous four causes. The material cause, the bronze; the formal cause, the shape of the statue; the efficient cause, the sculptor's hand; and the final cause, the purpose, perhaps to honor a deity. In this framework, change is not an illusion but a real transition from potentiality to actuality. Aristotle famously distinguishes between potentiality, dynamis, and actuality, energeia or intelligeia, stating, "Potentiality and actuality are the two aspects of being." An acorn, in this view, is potentially an oak. It contains within it the capacity to become a full-grown tree. When the conditions are right, the potential is actualized. This example illustrates the early ontological category of potential versus actual, a distinction that will echo through medieval and modern metaphysics. The transition from the classical world to the medieval period does not represent a break in the conversation, but rather a deepening of it, as new theological concerns become intertwined with the old philosophical questions. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, brings the Christian revelation into dialogue with Platonic thought. He adopts a version of the participation theory, asserting that all created things participate in the being of God. Augustine writes, "We are made by God, and we exist because we partake in the divine being." For Augustine, the immutable being of God is the ultimate source of all being, and the created world, though changeable, reflects that divine reality. This notion of participation provides a bridge between the eternal forms of Plato and the concrete substances of Aristotle, while simultaneously rooting the discussion in a theological framework. Boethius, a Roman philosopher of the early 6th century, further transmits these ideas to the medieval West through his Consolation of Philosophy and his commentaries on Aristotle. Boethius introduces the concept of translatio, the translation of the divine archetypes into the material world. He writes, "In the divine intellect there is a perfect translation of the forms, which the mind of man receives through illumination." For Boethius, the forms are not separate entities floating in a metaphysical realm, but divine ideas that are communicated to the human mind. This transmission preserves the reality of universals while allowing them to be known through reason, a move that will become crucial for later scholastic debates. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, stands at the pinnacle of this medieval synthesis. He masterfully weaves together Aristotle's substance ontology, Augustine's participation, and the Christian doctrine of creation. Aquinas famously defines act and potency, echoing Aristotle but infusing it with theological significance. He says God is pure act without any potency. All created beings are a mixture of act and potency, moving from potentiality toward their final end in God. In his Summa Theologica, Aquinas argues that the essence of a thing is its form, while its existence is given by God. This leads to his famous distinction between essence and existence, a distinction that would become a cornerstone of later metaphysical inquiry. Aquinas also engages directly with the problem of universals, defending a moderate realism. Universals exist in the mind of God, are instantiated in particular things, and are known through abstraction. To bring these abstract ideas to life, let us pause and imagine two vivid historical moments. First, picture the Eleatic debate in the Athenian Agora, a scene that has been dramatized by later writers. Parmenides, standing tall and solemn, addresses the crowd, his voice resonating against the marble columns. He declares that change is impossible, that the senses deceive us. Across from him, a young Heraclitean, perhaps a disciple of the river-dwelling philosopher, steps forward and gestures toward the flowing water of a nearby fountain. He points to the water slipping through his fingers and says, "Observe, my friend, how the water that you hold now is not the same water you held a moment ago. Yet the fountain remains." The crowd murmurs, torn between the certainty of the Eleatic monism and the palpable evidence of flux. This encounter, whether fully historical or partly legendary, encapsulates the very heart of early ontological conflict, the tension between the desire for an unchanging foundation and the undeniable experience of change. The second anecdote transports us to the stone cloisters of the University of Paris in the late 13th century. There, Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, is engaged in a heated disputation with a group of Dominican masters, some of whom are influenced by the emerging nominalist trend. One of the Dominicans, perhaps a follower of Roscelin, raises his hand and asks, "Master Aquinas, if universals exist only in the mind of God, how can we speak of them at all? Are they not merely words we use to group similar things?" Aquinas, calm and measured, replies, "The universals are not independent entities apart from God, but they are real insofar as they are rooted in his intellect." When we speak of humanity, we are referring to the participation of each individual soul in the divine idea of the human. The debate continues late into the night, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the vaulted ceiling, each argument echoing the ancient dispute between Parmenides and Heraclitus, now reframed in the language of Christian theology. This episode illustrates how the medieval mind did not abandon the classical questions, but re-engaged them, using the tools of scholastic method to probe deeper. Returning to our philosophical categories, let us consider the distinction between substance and accident, a core Aristotelian concept that finds fresh expression in medieval thought. Imagine a brilliant red ruby set in a gold ring. The ruby itself, its crystalline structure, its chemical composition is the substance. It is what the ruby is. Its redness, its sparkle, its size are accidents. They can change without the ruby ceasing to be a ruby. If the ruby is heated and its color fades, the accident of redness changes, but the substance remains. Augustine would say that the ruby participates in the divine light that makes its color possible, while Aquinas would argue that the accidents are present in the substance as ways the substance can be expressed. This example helps us see how the ontology of substance versus accident provides a framework for understanding change, without denying the underlying continuity of being. Now let us turn to the potential actual distinction which Aristotle introduced and Aquinas refined. Consider an uncarved block of marble. In its raw state, the marble has the potential to become a statue of Athena. The sculptor's vision, the tools, and the act of carving transform this potential into actuality. The marble's form as a statue is not present until the act of carving occurs, yet the potential is there, waiting to be actualized. In a theological sense, Aquinas would say that the marble's potential to become a statue reflects God's providential power to bring potentialities to fulfillment. The potential actual framework thus offers a way to speak about change as a movement from possibility to reality, rather than a denial of being. We have seen how the early philosophers grappled with the nature of being, how they proposed categories to make sense of the world, and how medieval thinkers wove these ideas into a Christian worldview. Yet the story does not end with Aquinas. The very categories he defended would soon be challenged by a new movement, Nominalism. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, thinkers such as Roscelin of Campigny and later William of Ockham began to question the reality of universals. Roscelin famously declared, "Universals are nothing but names, nomina, we assign to groups of particulars." He argued that when we say man or red, we are merely using a convenient label. There is no separate entity called manness that exists apart from individual men. William of Ockham sharpened this critique, insisting that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, a principle that would become known as Occam's razor. Ockham wrote, "The existence of universals is an unnecessary hypothesis. We can explain language and thought without positing them." For Ockham, only particular, individual substances exist. Universals are mental constructs, useful for communication but lacking ontological status. The nominalist challenge raises a powerful counter-argument to the realist positions of Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. If universals are mere names, then the problem of how the forms or the divine ideas can be present in particular things dissolves. The debate sharpens into the classic problem of universals. Do abstract entities have an existence independent of the mind, or are they merely linguistic tools? This question reverberates through the centuries, influencing later medieval debates such as the disputes between the Thomists and the Scotists, and eventually resurfacing in modern analytic philosophy with figures like John Locke, who argued for real ideas, and later David Hume, who denied any rational basis for universal concepts. To appreciate the depth of this problem, let us revisit the example of the statue again, now from a nominalist perspective. The statue's beauty is not an entity that exists independently. It is a term we use to describe a collection of sensory experiences, its smoothness, its proportion, its reflective surface. When we say the statue is beautiful, we are not referring to an abstract form of beauty residing in the statue, but rather to a shared human response. Similarly, the concept of humanity does not exist as a universal form. It is a convenient label for the set of individual humans we encounter. This shift from realism to nominalism does not merely change terminology. It reorients the entire metaphysical landscape, questioning whether any ontological categories beyond the particular can be sustained. Yet, even as nominalism gains traction, the realist tradition does not disappear. In the late medieval period, scholars such as John Duns Scotus develop a nuanced position known as univocity of being, arguing that being is said in the same sense of both God and creatures, but with different degrees of intensity. Scotus writes, "Being is one, but it is not the same." He attempts to preserve universals while also accommodating the transcendence of the divine. This move anticipates later discussions in modern philosophy about the nature of existence itself, as explored by existentialists and phenomenologists. The problem of universals also resurfaces in early modern philosophy. René Descartes, in his Meditations, introduces the notion of clear and distinct ideas, suggesting that the mind can grasp universal concepts directly, yet he remains ambiguous about their ontological status. Later, Immanuel Kant would transform the debate by arguing that universals are categories of the mind that structure experience, not things in themselves. He writes, "The categories are not derived from experience. They are the conditions of the possibility of experience." Kant thus offers a third way, a transcendental idealism that sidesteps the metaphysical commitment to independent universals while preserving the necessity of universal concepts for cognition. Returning to the ancient foundations, we see how the early tension between Parmenides and Heraclitus foreshadows these later disputes. Parmenides' insistence that non-being is not can be read as a radical form of realism. Only what truly exists in a full and unchanging sense can be spoken of meaningfully. Heraclitus, by contrast, emphasizes the ever-changing nature of reality, suggesting that any static notion of being is inadequate. Their debate can be reframed in modern terms as a clash between a metaphysics of substance and a metaphysics of process. Process philosophers such as Alfred North Whitehead would later revive Heraclitean themes, arguing that reality is fundamentally constituted by events and becoming, not by static substances. The medieval synthesis of Aquinas shows how the classical categories can be reinterpreted to accommodate both substance and process. Aquinas' act-potency framework allows for a dynamic understanding of being. God is pure act, immutable, while creatures are composites of act and potency, moving toward their telos. This synthesis demonstrates the flexibility of the early ontological categories, showing that they can be adapted to new theological and philosophical contexts. Let us now reflect on how these ancient and medieval ideas continue to shape contemporary thought. In contemporary analytic metaphysics, the debate over universals has been revitalized by philosophers such as David Lewis, who defends a modal realism in which possible worlds are as real as the actual world, and by others who defend a trope theory where particular properties, tropes, are the fundamental ontological units, rejecting abstract universals. Trope theorists echo nominalist concerns, emphasizing particularized properties over abstract forms. Meanwhile, philosophers of language like Saul Kripke examine how names refer to particular individuals and how necessity and possibility relate to the essence of things, echoing the Aristotelian distinction between essence and accidents. In the When we turn our gaze toward the modern turn in ontology, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads where the rationalist torch of the 17th century meets the empiricist lantern of the 18th. It is a meeting place of ideas that continues to echo in the corridors of contemporary philosophy, and it is here that the very question of what it means to be is reframed, reshaped, and at times shattered. In this segment, we will walk through the minds of René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Gottfried Leibniz, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, and then pause to hear the voice of Immanuel Kant, who would later stand as a critical bridge between these two traditions. Along the way, we will examine concrete examples, the ancient puzzle of the ship of Theseus and the imagined tree in a distant forest, so that the abstract arguments acquire flesh, blood, and everyday relevance. I invite you to settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea, and let the ideas unfold at a measured pace, allowing each thought to settle before we move to the next. Let us begin with the man whose name has become synonymous with I think, therefore I am. René Descartes, a French mathematician turned philosopher, retreated in 1628 to the quiet cloister of the Abbey of Saint-Mère-Église in Normandy. It was there, in the stillness of the monastery's stone walls, that he began his famous meditations. He wrote, "I will suppose, therefore, that I am a thinking thing," a radical methodological doubt that stripped away every belief that could possibly be called uncertain. In the silence of his cell, Descartes imagined a world where the senses deceived, where the external world might be an elaborate illusion, and yet he found that one thing could not be doubted. The very act of doubting required a doubter. Cogito ergo sum, he declared, and with that simple, almost poetic formula, he erected a foundation for being that rested not on the external world, but on the internal activity of thought itself. This foundational act of being, this cogito, was more than a statement about self-knowledge. It was, for Descartes, the first clear step in a grand ontological architecture. He distinguished between two distinct substances. Res cogitans, the thinking substance, and res extensa, the extended substance. The former is characterized by thought, doubt, understanding, the latter by spatial extension, divisibility, and the capacity to occupy place. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes writes, "I am a substance whose essence consists solely in thought, and which is entirely distinct from a substance whose essence consists solely in extension." This dualism, as it later came to be called, set up a clear ontological divide. The mind, immaterial and indivisible, and the body, material and divisible. From this dualism emerged Descartes' ontological proof of God. He argued that the idea of a perfect, infinite being could not have originated from a finite, imperfect mind. The very presence of this idea, he claimed, must be caused by something that actually possesses the perfection it represents. In his own words, "I have an idea of God which is that of a being supremely perfect, and therefore this idea must have been placed in me by a being that truly possesses those perfections." In other words, the existence of the idea of God serves as a sort of ontological bridge, linking the thinking substance to a supreme, self-sustaining substance that guarantees the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. For Descartesians, this proof was not merely theological, it was an ontological necessity, a proof that the very structure of being required a guarantor of truth. Yet even as Descartes was constructing this towering edifice of mind-body dualism, another rationalist was laying a very different foundation. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher of Portuguese Jewish descent, read Descartes with both admiration and profound disagreement. Spinoza's magnum opus, the Ethics, opens with a bold proclamation, Deus sive natura, God or nature are one and the same. For Spinoza, there is only one substance, infinite and self-caused, encompassing both thought and extension within a single, unified reality. He writes, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God." In this monist view, the distinction between mind and body collapses. Rather, they are merely two attributes of the one substance. The rationalist project for Spinoza is not to bifurcate reality, but to understand the necessary modes through which the single substance expresses itself. Spinoza's monism offers a striking counterpoint to Descartes' dualism. Where Descartes saw the mind as a private theater, Spinoza sees thought and extension as two lenses through which we observe the same underlying reality. This shift has profound ontological implications. The question of what is being becomes a question of how does the one substance manifest. The answer for Spinoza is that every finite thing, every idea, every body is a mode, a particular expression of the infinite substance, subject to the same deterministic laws. If we move further along the rationalist line, we encounter Gottfried Leibniz, a German polymath who sought to reconcile the mechanistic universe with a metaphysical principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz rejected both Cartesian dualism and Spinozan monism, proposing instead a universe composed of an infinite number of simple, indivisible entities he called monads. In his Monadology, Leibniz describes monads as windowless substances, each reflecting the whole universe from its own perspective, yet never interacting causally with one another. He writes, "Each monad is a living mirror of the whole universe." Monads are not material in the ordinary sense, they are metaphysical points, each possessing its own internal principle of action, a perception, and an appetition. The ontological picture here is one of a plenum of self-contained centers of being, each unfolding according to a pre-established harmony set by God. Leibniz's monads provide an elegant solution to the problem of interaction that plagued Descartes. If mind and body are distinct substances that cannot directly affect one another, how does the mind cause the arm to move? In Leibniz's framework, the apparent causal chain is merely the synchronization of monadic states orchestrated by God's initial design. The world, then, is a tapestry of parallel streams, each mirroring the others without direct contact, yet producing the illusion of interaction. Having traced the rationalist lineage, we now shift to the empiricist challenge. John Locke, writing in the late 17th century, begins his essay concerning human understanding with a sweeping denial. No ideas, therefore, are innate. For Locke, the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which experience writes. He distinguishes between primary qualities, those that exist in the objects themselves, such as solidity, extension, motion, and number, and secondary qualities, which are not in the objects but are powers to produce sensations in us, like color, taste, and sound. Locke asserts the primary qualities are the ones which belong to the object, the secondary qualities are the ones which belong to the mind. In this schema, being is tied to the perceivable attributes of objects, but the mind's role is to organize, compare, and abstract these qualities into ideas. Locke's empiricism carries an ontological implication. The existence of external objects is inferred from the regularity and coherence of our sensory experiences, but we never have direct access to the things in themselves. The external world is, for Locke, a reality that we can know only through the mediation of ideas. This stance already begins to erode the rationalist certainty that the cogito could guarantee the existence of an external substance. George Berkeley pushes the empiricist critique further, taking the radical step of denying material substance altogether. In his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, Berkeley famously declares, "Esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived." He argues that the only things that exist are minds and their ideas. There is no stuff that exists independently of perception. To illustrate his point, Berkeley invites us to imagine a tree standing in a remote forest, far beyond any human eye. If no mind ever perceives that tree, he asks, does it still exist? He answers, no, because its existence consists in being perceived. Yet he anticipates the objection that the tree must continue to exist when we are not looking at it. Berkeley resolves this by invoking God as the ultimate perceiver. God perceives all things at all times, thus the tree continues to exist in God's mind. In this way, Berkeley preserves the continuity of existence while denying material substance. Berkeley's critique is not merely a philosophical curiosity, it destabilizes the ontological assumptions of both rationalists and empiricists. By denying that there is any underlying substance beyond perception, he forces us to confront the question. What does it mean for something to be, if not to occupy space, to have mass, to persist independently? His position invites a re-examination of the relationship between language, perception, and reality. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher writing a few decades after Berkeley, takes the empiricist skepticism to its most rigorous conclusion. In his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume famously dissects the notion of the self. He argues that when we introspect, we encounter a bundle of fleeting impressions, sensations, emotions, thoughts, rather than a stable, enduring self. He writes, "I never can catch myself at any time, but a bundle or collection of different perceptions." The self, then, is a fiction, a convenient label for a constantly shifting flow of mental events. Hume also attacks the principle of causation, which undergirds much of our ontological reasoning. He notes that we never observe any necessary connection between cause and effect. We only observe constant conjunction. One event regularly follows another. The mind, he claims, habitually projects an expectation of future regularity based on past experience, but this expectation is not grounded in any rational necessity. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life, Hume says, and the only principle by which we can connect the ideas of cause and effect. In this view, the ontological status of causation becomes a habit of thought rather than a metaphysical necessity. To make Hodge's skepticism more concrete, consider the classic example of a billiard ball striking another. We see the first ball move, then the second ball move, and we infer a causal link. Yet Hume would ask, have we ever seen the power that moves the second ball? No, we only see the succession. The belief that the first ball caused the second is a product of custom, not of logical proof. This undermines any ontological claim that relies on necessary connections, whether it be the mind's ability to cause bodily motion, as in Descartes, or the deterministic unfolding of monads, as in Leibniz. Having outlined the rationalist and empiricist positions, let us now bring two concrete, timeless examples into the discussion. The first is the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment that dates back to Plutarch, but has been repurposed by modern philosophers to probe the nature of substance and identity. Imagine a ship, the very vessel that carried Theseus back to Athens. Over time, each wooden plank decays and is replaced with a new one. After many years, every original plank has been substituted. Is the ship, now composed entirely of new wood, still the ship of Theseus? Moreover, suppose we collect all the original planks and reassemble them into a ship. Which ship, if either, is the authentic Theseus? In the rationalist framework, Descartes might answer by appealing to the underlying substance. The ship's essence, as a res extensa, is tied to its continuity of extension, not to the particular material particles. For Spinoza, the ship is merely a mode of the one substance, and its identity depends on the particular arrangement of attributes at a given time. Leibniz would say each monad that constitutes the ship carries a perspective of the whole. As the planks change, the monadic states shift, but the overall pattern persists, preserving identity in a relational sense. Locke, focusing on primary qualities, would argue that the ship's identity rests on its shape, size, and functional role, qualities that may survive the replacement of parts. Berkeley, however, would deny that there is any ship in itself beyond perception. The ship exists insofar as it is perceived by minds, perhaps continuously by God. Hume would caution us that the notion of the same ship is a habit of thought, a mental projection we impose on a succession of changing experiences. The second example brings Berkeley's critique to life. Picture a towering oak tree deep within an untouched forest, far from any human settlement. No human eye ever falls upon its leaves, no human hand ever touches its bark. According to Berkeley, does this tree exist? He would answer, only insofar as it is perceived by God. The tree's being is therefore not anchored in an independent material substrate, but in the continuous perception of an infinite mind. If we imagine a world without any perceiving subject, no humans, no animals, no divine mind, Berkeley's framework would leave the tree in a state of non-existence. This stark illustration forces us to confront the limits of materialist ontology. If all we ever encounter are ideas, what grounds the persistence of those ideas when no perceiver is present? The answer for Berkeley is the divine perceiver, a move that reintroduces a metaphysical guarantor, albeit of a different sort than Descartes' ontological proof. These examples illuminate how each philosopher's ontology handles the problem of persistence and identity. They also reveal the tension between a metaphysics that seeks immutable substances and one that embraces flux and perception. Now let us turn to the counterarguments that emerged in response to both rationalist and empiricist claims. Immanuel Kant, writing in the late 18th century, offers a synthesis that refuses to be captured wholly by either camp. In his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argues that both rationalist metaphysics and empiricist reduction suffer from a fundamental mistake. They treat the content of our experience as if it were the content of the world itself. Kant introduces the notion of the transcendental aesthetic and the categories of the understanding. Space and time, he claims, are not properties of things in themselves, but forms of intuition that structure all of our experience. The categories unity, plurality, causality, necessity, and so forth are pure concepts that the mind imposes on the manifold of sensory data. In Kant's own words, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. The implication for ontology is profound. What we can know about being is limited to the way our cognitive faculties shape phenomena. The noumenal realm, the thing in itself, remains forever inaccessible. Kant's critique thus rejects Descartes' claim that the cogito guarantees knowledge of a substance that exists independently of our perception. The cogito for Kant is a judgment that presupposes the categories of unity and existence, which are themselves conditions of possible experience. Similarly, Kant challenges Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities by showing that even primary qualities, extension, shape, motion, are mediated by the a priori forms of space and time. The tree in the remote forest is not a raw datum, it is already structured by the mind's spatial-temporal framework. Berkeley's idealism, too, meets Kant's skepticism. While Berkeley correctly notes that we never have direct access to material substance, Kant points out that the very notion of perception presupposes a subject that is already structured by categories. In other words, the problem is not whether material substance exists, but whether our concepts can ever capture it. Kant's transcendental idealism thus reframes the debate. The question becomes not what is the ultimate substance, but what are the conditions that make any experience of being possible. This shift moves ontology toward epistemology, a move that would dominate German idealism and later analytic philosophy. The categories become the scaffolding upon which any ontological claim must be built, and any claim that attempts to speak of things in themselves without regard to these conditions is, in Kant's view, a speculative overreach. To appreciate the human dimension behind these lofty arguments, consider the anecdote of Descartes in his monastery. Legend has it that, after a night of intense meditation, Descartes awoke with a sudden clarity that the mind, in its purest form, could not be doubted. He reportedly walked out into the early morning mist, feeling as though he had emerged from a dark cave into the bright light of reason. He later recounted that the quiet of the cloister, the rhythmic tolling of the bell, and the simple act of breathing in the cool air all contributed to the mental space needed for his radical doubt. This image of the philosopher in solitude, wrestling with the foundations of being, underscores the personal, almost ascetic, dedication required to confront ontological questions at such depth. Contrast this with the bustling coffee houses of 18th century Edinburgh, where David Hume often debated with fellow scholars over steaming cups of strong coffee. In one famous exchange, Hume's interlocutor challenged him on the reliability of causation, asking, "If you have never seen a cause, how can you claim it exists?" We begin, as we often do in philosophy, with a question that seems simple yet unfolds into an endless horizon. What does it mean to be, not merely what exists, but the way in which being is experienced, the texture of existence as it appears to us from within? This is the terrain that phenomenology and existential ontology have mapped for the past century, a terrain where consciousness, time, freedom, and nothingness intersect. In the calm of this exploration, let us pause, breathe, and allow the ideas to settle, as if we were holding a candle before a darkened wall, watching the shadows reveal the shape of the thing itself. Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, gave us the first systematic tools to approach that wall. He invited us to perform what he called the epiché, the suspension of the natural attitude, the everyday belief that the world simply is, that objects exist independently of our perception, and that we need not examine the act of perceiving itself. In his own words, the epiché is the suspension of judgment about the existence of the external world, so that we may attend to the pure phenomena as they present themselves. By bracketing the world, we do not deny its existence. Rather, we set aside our presuppositions and attend to the way things appear to us, to the intentional structure of consciousness. Intentionality, for Husserl, is the hallmark of every act of consciousness. Every thought, perception, desire, or imagination is always about something. The mind is not an empty vessel, it is a directedness toward objects, toward meanings, toward essences. Imagine, if you will, a camera lens that you gently cover with a filter that blocks all light except the faintest glimmer of the subject itself. The filter does not erase the subject. It merely prevents the surrounding illumination from obscuring the pure form of the thing you wish to study. Husserl's epiché works much the same way. It filters out the background noise of scientific theories, cultural habits, and everyday expectations, allowing the philosopher to focus on the things themselves, die Sachen selbst. In this filtered view, the essence of a phenomenon, its invariant structure, emerges. The taste of a lemon is not reduced to a chemical formula. Rather, the lived experience of its sharpness, its bright color, its sudden jolt on the tongue, all coalesce into an essential quality that we can describe, compare, and reflect upon. Husserl's method also introduced the concept of the phenomenological reduction, a two-step process. First, we perform the epichet, setting aside the natural attitude. Second, we engage in the reduction proper, which involves transcendentalizing the experience, moving from the concrete act of perception to the underlying intentional structures that make that act possible. It is through this reduction that Husserl believes we can access the transcendental ego, the pure subjectivity that constitutes meaning. He writes, "The transcendental ego is the source of all meaning, the ground upon which the world of appearances is constituted." This bold claim, that the world is, in a deep sense, constituted by our conscious acts, sets the stage for the radical reinterpretations that follow. Enter Martin Heidegger, a student of Husserl who, in the early 1920s, began to feel that phenomenology needed a more fundamental reorientation. While Husserl was still focused on the structures of consciousness, Heidegger turned his gaze toward the question of being itself, the ancient question that had been forgotten in the wake of modern science. In his magnum opus, Being and Time, he distinguishes between being sane and being sciens. For Heidegger, beings are the particular things that populate the world, chairs, trees, thoughts, while being is the condition that makes those things intelligible as beings at all. It is not a thing among things, but the horizon against which all things appear. Heidegger introduces the term Dasein, literally being there, to denote human existence. Dasein is not a subject in the Cartesian sense. It is a being that is always already situated in a world, always already engaged with other beings, and always already oriented toward its own possibilities. He describes Dasein as thrown, Geoffenheit, into a world it did not choose, yet it must project itself forward, taking up possibilities in the face of that thrownness. The structure of Dasein's existence is what Heidegger calls care, Sorge. Care is the fundamental way Dasein relates to the world. It cares about its own being, cares about others, cares about the things that matter. In this sense, existence is not a static state, but a dynamic unfolding of possibilities, a continual movement between the past, what has been thrown, the present, the facticity of one's situation, and the future, the projection of possibilities. To illustrate Heidegger's insight, picture a sailor on a small boat at sea. The sailor did not choose the storm that now surrounds him. The storm has thrown him into a particular situation. Yet he must navigate, projecting a course toward a distant harbor, caring for the safety of his vessel, his crew, and his own survival. The sailor's being is defined not by the storm alone, nor by the harbor alone, but by the ongoing tension between the two, the care that drives his decisions. This analogy captures the essence of Dasein's thrownness, projection, and care. Heidegger's reinterpretation is not merely abstract. It emerged from a concrete historical moment, a series of lectures in 1927 at the University of Freiburg that would later be compiled as the Phenomenology of the Age of the World. In those lectures, Heidegger famously declared that the question of being had been forgotten, that philosophy had become preoccupied with the ontic, the study of particular beings, while neglecting the ontological, the study of being itself. He recounted a story of a student who asked, "What is the meaning of being?" And Heidegger responded, "It is the most fundamental question that has ever been asked, and yet it is the one we have most failed to ask." This moment, captured in the notes of his assistant, marks the turning point where phenomenology shifted from a description of consciousness to an existential analysis of human existence. Sartre, coming after both Husserl and Heidegger, takes the existential turn even further. In his seminal work Being and Nothingness, Sartre affirms Husserl's intentionality, but adds a radical twist. Consciousness is not only directed toward objects, it is also a nothingness that negates, that makes the world possible by refusing to be fully determined by it. He famously proclaims, "Existence precedes essence," meaning that we are not born with a predetermined nature. Rather, we first exist, find ourselves in a world, and then define ourselves through our choices. Sartre distinguishes between being in itself, erder and soi, the mode of being of objects that simply are, and being for itself, erder por soi, the mode of being of consciousness that is aware of its own lack, its freedom, its capacity to transcend the given. A vivid illustration of this distinction comes from the anecdote often called the café existentialism story. In post-war Paris, Sartre and a circle of friends would gather at the Café de Flore, sipping espresso while debating the nature of freedom. One evening, a young waiter, after overhearing their discussion, asked, "If I am free, why must I serve you?" Sartre smiled and replied, "Because you have chosen in this moment to serve." Your freedom is exercised in the very act of choosing to fulfill your role, even if that role seems imposed. The waiter's simple question cuts to the heart of Sartre's claim. Freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the capacity to choose within constraints, to affirm one's own project in the face of the given. Sartre's concept of nothingness also leads to his analysis of the look, le regard, where the presence of the other reduces the for self to an object, turning it into a being in itself. Yet this objectification is not a death sentence for freedom. Rather, it reveals the tension between the self's desire to be a subject and the other's power to define it. Sartre writes, "The other is the one who makes me aware that I am an object." This paradoxical relationship underscores the existential condition. We are always both subjects and objects, always navigating the space between self-definition and external definition. Now, as we deepen our exploration, we must also listen to the voices that challenge these grand narratives. One of Heidegger's most prominent critics, Hans-Georg Gadamer, argued that Heidegger's emphasis on the ontological horizon neglected the historicity of understanding. In his philosophical hermeneutics, Gadamer posits that meaning is always mediated by tradition, language, and dialogue. He famously writes, "Understanding is always affected through a fusion of horizons." For Gadamer, the epoché cannot fully suspend the historicity embedded in language. Any attempt to do so is already a linguistic act that carries its own biases. Thus, the phenomenological reduction, while valuable, cannot escape the interpretive structures that shape our experience. Gadamer's critique invites us to see phenomenology not as a pure, detached observation, but as an ongoing conversation with the past. Another critical voice comes from Jacques Derrida, who deconstructed the very notion of presence that underlies much of phenomenology. Derrida's concept of difference suggests that meaning is always deferred, never fully present. He writes, "There is nothing outside the text," meaning that any attempt to capture the essence of a phenomenon is always already mediated by language, signs, and the play of differences. In this view, the phenomenological quest for things themselves is always already compromised by the fact that we can never step outside the linguistic horizon that structures our thought. Derrida's critique does not merely undermine phenomenology. It expands the conversation to include the instability of meaning, the endless chain of signification that prevents any final grasp of being. Sartre's existential ontology also faced vigorous debate, most famously with Albert Camus over the notion of absurdity. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, argues that the human condition is defined by a fundamental conflict between our desire for meaning and the indifferent universe that offers none. He writes, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." While Sartre acknowledges absurdity, he insists that consciousness can assert its freedom and create meaning through action. Camus, however, warns against the hubris of declaring that we can fully overcome the absurd. Instead, he proposes a revolt, a continuous conscious rebellion against meaninglessness, without the promise of ultimate resolution. This debate sharpens the stakes of existential ontology. Is freedom a triumphant claim over the void or a perpetual struggle within it? Having heard these counterpoints, we might wonder, why does this philosophical dialogue matter beyond the ivory tower? The answer lies in the ways phenomenology and existential ontology have permeated diverse fields, shaping how we understand human experience in concrete contexts. In psychology, phenomenological methods have inspired qualitative approaches that prioritize lived experience over statistical abstraction. For instance, the practice of phenomenological interviewing, championed by scholars such as Amdio Georgi, seeks to capture the essence of patients' experiences of illness, depression, or trauma, allowing therapists to attend to the intentional structures of feeling rather than merely diagnosing symptoms. This approach has led to more empathetic care, where the therapist brackets their own assumptions to hear the patient's world as it appears to them. In the realm of architecture, phenomenology has guided designers to consider how spaces are experienced from the inside out. The Japanese architect Tadao Ando, for example, speaks of the silence of the void and designs buildings that invite occupants to become aware of light, shadow, and materiality as they move through space. By attending to the lived experience of architecture, designers create environments that resonate with the intentionality of perception, turning concrete walls into places of meaning. In contemporary philosophy of mind, phenomenology offers a counterpoint to the dominant computational theories of cognition. While cognitive scientists often model the mind as a processor of information, phenomenologists remind us that consciousness is not merely data processing, but a lived, embodied experience. The concept of embodied cognition, championed by scholars such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a student of Husserl, draws on phenomenology to argue that perception is inseparable from the body's situated engagement with the world. Merleau-Ponty writes, "The body is our general medium for having a world." This insight has influenced fields ranging from robotics, where engineers strive to create machines that navigate environments as humans do, to cognitive linguistics, which examines how bodily experience shapes language. Let us return for a moment to Heidegger's 1927 lecture series, a historical anecdote that illustrates the palpable excitement of that era. In the winter of 1927, a small group of students gathered in a modest lecture hall in Freiburg, the room heated by a single stove. Heidegger entered, his eyes bright, and began to speak of the forgotten question of being. He paused, looked around, and asked, "Do you ever feel that the world is a stage, but the actors have forgotten the script?" The students murmured, some skeptical, some intrigued. After the lecture, one student, a young woman named Hannah Arendt, approached him and whispered, "You have awakened something in me that I cannot yet name." That moment, recorded in the diary of one of the attendees, marks the birth of a generation of thinkers who would carry Heidegger's existential analysis into politics, literature, and beyond. A second anecdote transports us to the smoky back rooms of the Café de Flore in post-war Paris, where Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, along with a rotating cast of intellectuals, gathered to discuss the absurdity of the recent conflict and the possibilities of freedom. One evening, after a heated debate about the moral responsibility of the writer, a French resistance fighter, fresh from the underground, stood up and declared, "We fought not because we believed in a grand narrative, but because we could not stand idle while the world crumbled." Sartre, listening intently, responded, "Then we must write our lives as we would write a novel, without a predetermined plot, but with the courage to choose each chapter." This exchange, captured in a letter de Beauvoir sent to a friend, underscores how existential ontology was not merely an academic exercise, but a lived philosophy that informed actions in a world still reeling from war. In the decades that followed, the influence of phenomenology and existential ontology rippled outward, intersecting with post-structuralist critiques. Michel Foucault, while critical of essentialist notions, borrowed Heidegger's analysis of being in the world to explore how power structures embed themselves in everyday practices. He wrote, "The subject is not a pre-existing entity but a product of discursive formations." Yet, unlike Heidegger, Foucault emphasized the historical contingency of these formations, suggesting that the structures of power shape the very possibilities of being. This dialogue illustrates how the phenomenological focus on lived experience can be reoriented toward the analysis of social institutions, opening new pathways for critical theory. Similarly, the contemporary philosopher Dan Zahavi revisits Husserl's Phenomenology to defend the possibility of a first-person perspective against the encroachment of neuro-reductionism. Zahavi argues that the transparent nature of experience, its self-evidence to the subject, cannot be fully captured by brain scans. He writes, "Phenomenology reminds us that consciousness is not a thing among things. It is the very condition for the appearance of things." In doing so, Zahavi bridges the gap between classic phenomenology and modern cognitive science, suggesting that a rigorous descriptive account of experience can complement, rather than contradict, empirical findings. Let us now turn to concrete, everyday examples that illustrate these philosophical insights. Imagine a person standing at a bustling train station, waiting for a train that is perpetually delayed. The ambient noise, the flickering digital boards, the hurried footsteps of strangers, all form a complex field of experience. From a Husserlian perspective, the person's consciousness intentionally directs attention toward the arrival time, the sensation of impatience, the expectation of movement. The epiché would have this person set aside the assumption that the train will arrive on time, focusing instead on the lived experience of waiting, the feeling of time stretching, the awareness of one's own bodily tension. This intentional focus reveals the essence of waiting as a temporal phenomenon, a lived tension between present and future. From Heidegger's angle, the same scene reveals Dasein's thrownness and projection. The individual is thrown into a world of schedules, public transportation systems, and social expectations. Yet they project possibilities. Perhaps they will read a book, perhaps they will call a friend, perhaps they will simply observe the crowd. The story of analytic ontology begins, not with a sudden flash of insight, but with a quiet, persistent questioning that took shape in the cafes of Vienna in the early 20th century. Imagine a group of bright-minded scholars gathered around a modest wooden table, the air thick with the scent of coffee and the hum of conversation. They were the members of the Vienna Circle, a fellowship of philosophers, physicists, and mathematicians who shared a single, urgent ambition: to cleanse philosophy of what they saw as idle speculation, to replace metaphysics with a rigorous science of language and verification. As Moritz Schlick would say, philosophy must become a logical analysis of the language of science. In that spirit, they embraced logical positivism, a doctrine that held that a proposition is meaningful only if it can be verified empirically or is analytically true. From that standpoint, traditional metaphysical questions about what exists were dismissed as nonsense. A.J. Ayer famously declared, "Metaphysics is the discipline that attempts to answer questions which cannot be answered." The circle's members, including Rudolf Carnap, argued that statements about being that could not be reduced to observational language were literally meaningless. Carnap, in his 1928 essay, The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language, wrote, "The task of philosophy is to make explicit the logical structure of scientific language, and not to posit a realm of entities beyond it." In the calm, reflective cadence of those meetings, the idea emerged that ontology, once the central concern of philosophy, had been relegated to the margins, a relic of a bygone era. Yet as the 1950s unfolded, a different voice began to echo across the same halls of academic inquiry. W.V.O. Quine, a student of Carnap but a restless thinker in his own right, took up the gauntlet and turned it on its own assumptions. In his seminal paper on What There Is, Quine asked a deceptively simple question: what is there? He argued that the question cannot be answered by a mere linguistic analysis, for language itself is entangled with the web of our beliefs. Quine's famous criterion of ontological commitment, the so-called ontological is omission test, states that to know what a theory says exists, we must look at the entities over which the theory quantifies. He wrote, "To be is to be the value of a bound variable." In other words, if a scientific theory speaks of electrons, numbers, or possible worlds, then, according to Quine, we are committed to their existence. Quine's revival of ontology was not a gentle return, it was a bold challenge to the positivist creed. In his 1951 lecture, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, he famously attacked the analytic-synthetic distinction and the reductionist view that each meaningful statement could be translated into a protocol sentence about immediate experience. He claimed the distinction between analytic truths and synthetic truths is a dogma that has been accepted without question. By dissolving this distinction, Quine opened a door for a new kind of metaphysics, one grounded not in speculative intuition, but in the very practice of scientific theorizing. From this point, the analytic tradition began to rebuild its ontological foundations, and three interlocking strands emerged: the criterion of ontological commitment, the development of possible world semantics, and the renewed debate over abstract objects. Let us first explore the criterion itself, for it provides the methodological compass that guides us through the maze of what we might call being. According to Quine, when a theory contains a variable that ranges over a domain, the theory is ontologically committed to that domain. If we write x is a prime number right arrow x1, we are quantifying over numbers, and thus, numbers are part of our ontology. This seemingly straightforward test has profound implications. It forces us to confront the existence of entities that never appear in any laboratory, yet are indispensable to the structure of our best scientific theories. Consider the case of the problem of the round square. At first glance, this is a mere linguistic puzzle. A round square cannot exist because the concepts round and square are mutually exclusive. Yet, if we write a sentence such as, "There exists an object that is both round and square," the quantifier x forces us to acknowledge the existence of something that satisfies the predicate. Quine would say that the sentence commits us to the existence of an entity that fulfills that contradictory description, even though we know it is impossible. The point, however, is not to assert that such an object exists, but to illustrate how the logical form of a statement can generate ontological commitments, irrespective of the content's coherence. The round square becomes a litmus test for the precision of our language. It reminds us that the grammar of quantification does not guarantee the plausibility of the entities it quantifies over. Moving from the concrete to the imaginative, we encounter David Lewis's bold venture into modal realism. Lewis, in his 1986 work on the plurality of worlds, argued that possible worlds are not mere abstractions or convenient fictions, but concrete, fully existent realms just as real as our own. He famously declared, "All possible worlds are as real as the actual world. They are not less real, they are merely not actual." According to Lewis, when we say that it is possible that there are unicorns, we are not merely expressing a logical possibility. We are referring to a world distinct from ours in which unicorns roam. In this framework, the ontology of possible worlds is vast. There are as many worlds as there are ways reality could have been. The unicorn in a possible world serves as a vivid illustration. In one of Lewis's worlds, a creature with a single horn, a horse's body, and a lion's mane grazes a meadow. The sentence "there exists a world W such that W contains a unicorn" is true, and by Lewis's criterion, we are committed to the existence of that world. Lewis's modal realism is not without its critics, however. Saul Kripke introduced a powerful counterpoint with his theory of rigid designators. In Naming and Necessity, Kripke argued that certain terms, proper names, natural kind terms, and certain definite descriptions refer to the same object in every possible world in which that object exists. He wrote, "Water is a rigid designator that picks out H2O in all possible worlds." This challenges Lewis's view that each world contains its own distinct individuals. If unicorn is a rigid designator, then it must refer to the same entity across worlds, which seems absurd, because unicorns do not exist in the actual world. Kripke's essentialism suggests that the identity of an object is determined by its essential properties, and that modal statements about necessity and possibility can be understood through the lens of these rigid designators. In this way, Kripke offers a more parsimonious ontology. We need not posit a plenitude of concrete worlds. Instead, we can talk about possibilities by considering the essential properties of objects within a single world. The debate over abstract objects, numbers, sets, propositions adds another layer to the ontological puzzle. Plato, in the ancient dialogues, posited that numbers exist in a realm of perfect forms, immutable and timeless. This Platonist view was revived in the 20th century by philosophers such as Michael Dummett, and more recently, by Neoplatonists who argue that mathematical entities are discovered, not invented. They point to the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world as evidence of an objective realm of numbers. As the mathematician G.H. Hardy famously remarked, the mathematician's patterns, like the painter's or the poet's, must be beautiful. The ideas must have a life of their own, independent of us. Opposing this, nominalists contend that abstract objects are merely linguistic or conceptual shortcuts. According to nominalism, when we say the number 3, we are not referring to a mysterious, non-physical entity, but to a convenient way of grouping three things together. Hartree-Field, in his project Science Without Numbers, attempted to reconstruct mathematics without any commitment to abstract entities, showing that it is at least formally possible to eliminate numbers from scientific theories. He wrote, "If we can do physics without numbers, then numbers are not indispensable to our best scientific theories." The nominalist's challenge, however, is to explain how mathematics can be so effective in describing the natural world without invoking any real abstract objects. To see the tension in action, let us consider two illustrative cases. First, the existence of numbers. When we write the equation 2 plus 2 equals 4, we are quantifying over the abstract entities 2, 4, and the operation plus. Quine's criterion would say that because our scientific and mathematical theories quantify over numbers, we are ontologically committed to their existence. Yet a nominalist might respond that the symbols are merely shorthand for concrete groupings of objects. 2 apples plus 2 apples yield a collection of 4 apples. The abstract numbers in this view are not entities but patterns we recognize. Second, the status of fictional characters such as Sherlock Holmes. When we say Sherlock Holmes lives at 221 billion Baker Street, we are speaking about a character who, strictly speaking, does not exist in the physical world. Yet we treat Holmes as if he occupies a certain narrative space. Philosophers like Alexius Meinung have argued for a realm of non-existent objects where fictional characters reside. By contrast, contemporary nominalists might claim that talking about Holmes is simply a useful linguistic maneuver, a way of referring to a set of propositions about the stories. Both approaches must grapple with the question: does our language obligate us to admit the existence of such entities, or can we simply dismiss them as useful fictions? The discussion of abstract objects inevitably leads us back to the broader theme of how language structures reality. Logical positivists in their early days would have dismissed both numbers and fictional characters as meaningless unless they could be empirically verified. Quine, however, opened the door for a more inclusive view, suggesting that the very act of quantification brings entities into our ontological map. Lewis extended this by showing that possible worlds can be treated as quantifiable domains, thereby expanding the scope of what we might consider real. Kripke, in turn, refined our understanding of reference, insisting that certain terms lock onto the same object across all worlds, thereby limiting the proliferation of entities. Putnam, with his internal realism, offered yet another perspective. "Meaning just ain't in the head," he famously quipped, suggesting that truth and reference are not fixed by an external metaphysical reality alone, but are shaped by our conceptual schemes and linguistic practices. Hilary Putnam's internal realism provides a compelling counterpoint to both Quine's externalist commitment and Lewis's concrete pluralism. Putnam argued that the truth of a statement depends on its role within a given conceptual framework, not on a mind-independent reality that stands apart from our theories. He wrote, "There is no such thing as a godlike viewpoint from which we can see the world as it truly is." For Putnam, the question, what exists, is inseparable from the question, what are we talking about? In this view, the ontological commitments of a theory are internal to the language game in which the theory is articulated. The existence of numbers, then, becomes a matter of whether the mathematical language we employ is indispensable to the practices we value, not a matter of discovering a hidden realm of Platonic forms. The interplay of these ideas can be seen vividly in contemporary debates about social ontology. When we speak of social groups, institutions, or collective intentions, are we referring to concrete entities, abstract structures, or merely convenient shorthand? Some philosophers, following John Searle, argue that social facts are constituted by collective intentionality and thus have a real, though non-physical, existence. Others, like Margaret Gilbert, propose a pluralistic ontology where different kinds of entities, material, mental, institutional, coexist, each governed by its own mode of being. The ontological pluralism that emerges here echoes Quine's willingness to accept a rich tapestry of commitments, while also resonating with Putnam's insistence that our conceptual schemes shape what we count as real. To illustrate how these abstract debates play out in everyday reasoning, imagine a courtroom scenario. A juror is asked whether the right to free speech exists. The juror must decide whether this abstract right is a real entity that can be defended or simply a legal construct. If we adopt a Quinian stance, we might say that because our legal system quantifies over rights, we are committed to their existence as abstract entities that have causal efficacy in the world of law. If we follow Putnam, we might argue that the right to free speech exists within the conceptual framework of liberal democracies, and its reality is contingent on the shared acceptance of that framework. In either case, the ontological status of the right is not a trivial matter. It influences how we argue, legislate, and adjudicate. Returning to the historical narrative, let us pause for a moment to picture the Vienna Circle's gatherings. In a modest lecture hall at the University of Vienna, Carnap would stand before a blackboard, his chalk tracing elegant logical symbols, while his colleagues, Rudolf Schlick, Otto Neurath, Philipp Frank, leaned in, sipping their coffee, their eyes alight with the promise of a new philosophy. Their meetings were not merely academic, they were a cultural experiment, an attempt to align the rigor of the natural sciences with the clarity of language. Yet, even within those circles, dissent simmered. Carnap himself, later in his career, softened his stance, acknowledging that some metaphysical questions might be unavoidable. He wrote, "We cannot simply dismiss all talk of being as meaningless. We must at least clarify what we are saying." This subtle shift foreshadowed the later revival of ontology that Quine would champion. Quine's own lecture, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, delivered at Harvard in 1950, was a turning point. He stood before a packed auditorium, his voice steady, and declared, "The analytic-synthetic distinction is a myth, and the reduction of each meaningful statement to a protocol sentence is an illusion." He then introduced his famous indeterminacy of translation thesis, suggesting that there is no fact of the matter about which translation of a foreign language is the correct one, because multiple, empirically equivalent translation manuals are possible. This radical skepticism about the foundations of meaning forced philosophers to confront the fact that our language and our world are intertwined in a web of belief, rather than a hierarchy of observation and logic. The ripple effects of this lecture were profound. It opened the door for a renewed interest in what it means for a theory to be true, for a statement to refer, and ultimately for something to exist. The debate over possible worlds, as championed by Lewis, also sparked a cascade of developments in modal logic. Saul Kripke, building on earlier work by Rudolf Carnap, introduced a formal semantics for modal statements that employed possible worlds as a mathematical tool without committing to their concrete existence. Kripke's possible world semantics treats worlds as points in a model, useful for evaluating the truth of modal formulas, but not necessarily as ontologically real. This subtle distinction allowed philosophers to retain the expressive power of modal logic while avoiding the metaphysical extravagance of Lewis's pluralism. Kripke's notion of rigid designators further refined this picture. A term like Aristotle refers to the same individual in every possible world where Aristotle exists, and to no individual in worlds where he does not. This insight helped resolve puzzles about essential properties, what it means for a property to be necessary rather than accidental. The tension between these positions can be illuminated through another historical anecdote. In the early 1970s, a small workshop at the University of Pittsburgh brought together philosophers interested in modal logic, including David Lewis, Saul Kripke, and a young philosopher named Kit Fine. Over a series of intense evenings, they debated whether possible worlds should be treated as concrete entities or as mere logical constructs. Lewis, ever the advocate of realism, argued that abandoning concrete worlds would undermine the explanatory power of modal realism. Kripke, with his characteristic calm, countered that the semantics could be understood purely formally, without ontological commitment. Fine, listening intently, suggested a middle path. Perhaps worlds are abstract objects that are nonetheless part of our ontology, akin to numbers. This dialogue, recorded in the minutes of the workshop, exemplifies how the analytic community grappled with the balance between linguistic convenience and metaphysical parsimony. Let us now turn to the concrete example of the unicorn in a possible world. Suppose we write the modal statement, it is possible that a unicorn exists. In Lewis's framework, this translates to: there exists a possible world W such that in W there is an entity U, and U is a unicorn. By the ontological is omission test, we are committed to the existence of such a world W and of the entity U within it. The unicorn then is not merely a fictional creature, it is a concrete being in a concrete world, albeit not in the actual world we inhabit. If we adopt Kripke's semantics, we might instead say that the statement is true if there is a possible world accessible from the actual world where the description, a creature with a single horn on its forehead and a horse's body, is satisfied. Here, the unicorn is a logical possibility, not an ontological commitment to a concrete entity. The distinction matters because it influences how we think about the status of fictional or mythological beings. Are they simply convenient placeholders in our language, or do they have a kind of existence in a broader ontological landscape? Now consider the problem of the round square. Imagine we assert there exists an object that is both round and square. When we turn our gaze toward the present, we discover that the ancient question, what is there, has taken on new urgency, new textures, new arenas of practice. Ontology is no longer the exclusive preserve of metaphysicians hunched over parchment in the cloisters of medieval universities. It lives now in particle accelerators, in the data streams that power our smartphones, in the algorithms that recommend the next song, and in the very way we speak about forests, rivers, and the climate that surrounds us. In this segment, we will trace how the age-old categories of being are being reshaped by contemporary science, technology, and everyday life. We will listen to the arguments of physicists who wrestle with the reality of the wave function, to engineers who build digital twins that seem to exist in a parallel world, and to environmental thinkers who insist that the non-human is not merely a backdrop, but a full participant in the drama of existence. Along the way, we will meet counter voices, instrumentalists who say that theories are merely tools, and feminist and post-colonial critics who warn that our new ontologies may conceal as much as they reveal. We will also recall the moments that made these debates vivid: the 2015 Nobel announcement that put the Higgs boson on the world stage, and the story of a modest tech startup that built an ontology-driven knowledge graph to make sense of a chaotic data landscape. By the end, you may find that the categories Aristotle once carved, substance, accident, potentiality, actuality, are echoing in the language of quantum fields, in the metadata of the internet, and in the ethics of planetary stewardship. Let us begin with quantum physics, perhaps the most striking arena where ontological commitments have become matters of experimental consequence. Since the early 20th century, the physics community has been divided between two broad families of interpretation. On one side stand the wave function realists, who maintain that the mathematical object known as the wave function, psi, does not merely encode our knowledge but corresponds to a concrete element of reality. On the other side, relational ontologists argue that what exists is not an absolute wave function, but a network of relationships, that the properties of particles are defined only in the context of interactions. The tension between these views is not a mere philosophical curiosity. It shapes how we design experiments, how we construct theories, and even how we allocate funding for large-scale facilities. Consider the wave function realist position most famously articulated by David Albert and earlier by the late John Bell. Bell wrote, "If the wave function is not real, then the world is a mere illusion of the mind." In this view, the wave function is a field of possibilities that exists independently of observers, a kind of ontological substrate that underlies all physical phenomena. The realist is compelled to ask, what is the ontological status of the Higgs boson, that particle whose discovery was announced in 2015? When the CERN press conference declared, "We have found a particle consistent with the Higgs boson," the world heard a triumph of human ingenuity. Yet behind those words lay a profound ontological question. Does the Higgs boson exist as a distinct entity, a localized excitation of the Higgs field, or is it a convenient shorthand for a pattern in the data that our instruments happen to pick up? The instrumentalist counterargument, championed by philosophers such as Bos van Fraassen, offers a different lens. Van Fraassen famously argued that scientific theories are empirically adequate if they correctly predict observable phenomena, regardless of whether the entities they postulate truly exist. From this perspective, the Higgs boson may be a useful fiction, a node in a model that helps us calculate cross-sections and decay rates, but not something that demands a metaphysical commitment. The instrumentalist would say that the Nobel Committee's citation of the discovery of a new particle is a pragmatic celebration, not an ontological verdict. To see the stakes more concretely, imagine the Large Hadron Collider as a vast, humming cathedral of steel and superconducting magnets. Inside, protons race at near light speed, colliding in bursts that generate a spray of subatomic debris. Detectors like ATLAS and CMS translate those fleeting sprays into torrents of data. The raw data are then filtered through layers of statistical analysis, culminating in a bump in the mass distribution that matches the predicted mass of the Higgs boson. The bump is a pattern, a statistical excess that we interpret as evidence for a particle. But the pattern itself is a relational structure, an emergent feature of the interaction between the detector, the software, and the theoretical model. A wave function realist would say that the bump reflects a real entity that existed prior to measurement. An instrumentalist would say the bump is a reliable signpost, but the underlying entity may remain forever beyond our grasp. The debate does not stop at the Higgs. It reverberates in the ongoing discussions about wave function collapse. The relational ontology championed by Carlo Rovelli, known as relational quantum mechanics, proposes that the state of a system is always relative to an observer. In Rovelli's words, the quantum state is not an absolute property of a system, it is a description of the information that one system has about another. This view dissolves the need for a universal, observer-independent wave function, replacing it with a web of intersubjective relations. The implication is profound. Reality becomes a tapestry of interactions, not a collection of isolated substances. Now, let us shift from the subatomic to the digital. In the world of artificial intelligence and data science, the term ontology has been repurposed to denote a structured representation of knowledge, a taxonomy of concepts, their attributes, and the relationships among them. Early pioneers like Nicola Guarino defined an ontology as a formal, explicit specification of a shared conceptualization. In practice, an ontology becomes the scaffolding upon which knowledge graphs are built, enabling machines to reason about entities as if they were objects in a virtual world. One vivid illustration of this is the concept of a digital twin. In engineering, a digital twin is a high-fidelity virtual model of a physical asset, a turbine, a bridge, or even an entire city, that runs in parallel with its real-world counterpart. Sensors on the physical asset stream data to the digital twin, which updates its state in real time. The twin can then be used for predictive maintenance, optimization, or scenario testing. At first glance, the digital twin appears to be a straightforward engineering tool, but it raises an ontological puzzle. Does the digital twin count as an entity in its own right, or is it merely a representation? To answer that, we can turn to the philosophical work of Tim Berners-Lee and his notion of the semantic web. He envisioned a web of data where machines could not only retrieve information, but also understand its meaning. In this vision, the digital twin is not a passive artifact but an active participant in a network of relations. Its being is defined by its connections to sensors, to simulation models, to decision-making algorithms. In that sense, the twin embodies a relational ontology reminiscent of Rovelli's quantum view, but now applied to engineered systems. Consider a concrete case, a startup called TwinForge that emerged in 2018 with the ambition to democratize digital twins for small-scale manufacturers. TwinForge built an ontology-driven knowledge graph that linked each component of a machine, gears, bearings, control circuits, to a set of performance parameters, maintenance histories, and supplier information. The knowledge graph allowed the twin to infer, for example, that a particular bearing's vibration signature indicated an imminent failure, even though that specific pattern had never been observed before. The startup's CEO often told investors, "Our twin doesn't just mirror the machine, it thinks about the machine." This claim rests on an ontological shift. The digital twin is treated as an entity with agency, albeit a computational one. It is not merely a dataset, it is a node in a larger network of actions and decisions. Yet, critics from feminist and post-colonial perspectives raise cautionary flags. Karen Barrett's agential realism, for instance, argues that reality is constituted through interactions, mutual becoming of subjects and objects, rather than through pre-existing entities that merely interact. Barrett writes phenomena are the ontological inseparability of matter and meaning. Applying Barrett's insight to digital twins, we might ask, who are the agents that bring the twin into being? Is it the engineers, the algorithms, the sensors, or the market forces that demand predictive analytics? By foregrounding the performative aspect of ontology, Barrett invites us to see the digital twin not as a neutral mirror, but as a site where power relations are enacted. The twin can reinforce existing hierarchies by privileging data from well-funded factories while marginalizing small producers whose sensors are less sophisticated, thereby reproducing inequities under the guise of technical objectivity. A similar critique emerges in the realm of quantum physics. Instrumentalists, as we noted, caution against ontological reification. But beyond instrumentalism, feminist philosophers such as Helen Longino have argued that the social values embedded in scientific practices shape what counts as a real entity. Longino writes, science is a social endeavor, and its epistemic standards are shaped by the community that practices it. In the case of the Higgs boson, the massive international collaboration, the funding structures, and the prestige attached to the Nobel Prize all contributed to a collective desire to discover a particle that fits a particular theoretical slot. The ontological status of the Higgs, therefore, cannot be disentangled from the socio-political context that framed its pursuit. Let us now turn to environmental philosophy, where ontology takes on an ethical dimension. Deep ecology, pioneered by Arne Nies, proposes an ontological egalitarianism. All living beings possess intrinsic value, independent of their utility to humans. Nies famously declared, "A living thing is a being whose life processes are organized in such a way that it can maintain its own existence." This ontological stance challenges the anthropocentric hierarchy that has dominated Western thought since the Enlightenment, a hierarchy that placed humanity at the apex of being. In recent years, scholars such as Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway have extended this relational ontology to the non-human more broadly, arguing for a more-than-human world where objects, technologies, and ecosystems co-constitute each other. Haraway's concept of situated knowledges suggests that our understanding of the world is always mediated by specific bodies and contexts. She writes, "The view from nowhere is a myth. Knowledge is always situated." When we apply this insight to climate change, we see that the ontology of the planet is not a static backdrop, but an active participant in political and technological discourses. The carbon budget, for instance, becomes an ontological entity, a quantified limit that shapes policy, markets, and even cultural narratives about responsibility. An illustrative example lies in the management of river basins. In the 1990s, the concept of river ontology emerged among environmental planners in the Netherlands. They began to treat the river not merely as a watercourse, but as an assemblage of flows, sediments, organisms, and human interventions, a dynamic system with its own agency. This shift echoed Aristotle's notion of potentiality and actuality. The river's capacity to change course, to flood, to support life, is not merely a set of physical parameters, but a lived reality that demands ethical consideration. By reconceptualizing the river as an ontological participant, policymakers introduced room for the river projects that deliberately allowed floodplains to expand, acknowledging the river's right to express its own dynamics. These environmental ontologies intersect with the digital world through the rise of environmental data ontologies. Projects like the Global Earth Observation System of Systems, GEOSS, develop standardized vocabularies to describe atmospheric, oceanic, and terrestrial phenomena. By encoding clouds, chlorophyll concentrations, and soil moisture as data entities, scientists create a digital ontology of the planet. Yet, as Barrett reminds us, the act of encoding is itself an interaction that shapes what we consider real. When satellite data label a region as a deforestation hotspot, that label carries political weight, influencing conservation funding and indigenous land rights. The ontology of the Earth becomes a contested terrain where scientific categories, economic interests, and cultural values collide. To see how historic ontological categories resurface, recall our earlier discussion of Aristotle's four causes: material, formal, efficient, final. In quantum physics, the material cause is the field, The formal cause is the wave function's mathematical structure. The efficient cause is the interaction that produces measurement outcomes. The final cause, if we dare to speak of one, might be the explanatory aim of the theory itself. In the digital twin, the material cause is the sensor data, the formal cause is the simulation model, the efficient cause is the computational engine that updates the twin, and the final cause is the optimization of performance. In environmental philosophy, the material cause is the ecosystem, the formal cause is the ecological network, the efficient cause is the processes of growth and disturbance, and the final cause, if we adopt a deep ecological perspective, might be the flourishing of all beings. Thus, the ancient schema continues to scaffold contemporary debates, even as the language has changed. Let us pause now to reflect on the anecdote that brought the Higgs boson into popular consciousness. On July 4, 2012, a date chosen deliberately for its symbolic resonance with American independence, the CERN press office released a video titled "The Higgs Boson." A new particle discovered. The video showed a montage of scientists cheering, confetti falling, and the iconic image of a particle track swirling on a detector screen. The voiceover declared, "We have found a new particle consistent with the Higgs boson." The world responded with awe, memes, and headlines proclaiming the God particle finally captured. Yet the very term God particle was a journalistic invention by Leon Lederman, meant to draw attention, not to convey ontological certainty. The phrase illustrates how language can shape the perception of what exists. By invoking God, the media framed the Higgs as a metaphysical cornerstone, even though physicists themselves remain divided over its ontological status. Fast forward to 2015, when the Nobel Committee awarded the prize in physics to Peter Higgs and François Englert for the theoretical prediction of the mechanism that endows particles with mass. In the Nobel lecture, Higgs said, "The existence of the Higgs field is a hypothesis that has been confirmed by experiment." The wording is subtle but significant. Hypothesis, confirmed. Confirmation, in the instrumentalist sense, does not guarantee ontological reality. It signals that the hypothesis is empirically adequate. Yet the Nobel ceremony, with its pomp and gravitas, functions as a cultural ritual that bestows a kind of ontological legitimacy. The award transforms a scientific model into a celebrated element of our shared worldview. Turning now to the story of the tech startup that built an ontology-driven knowledge graph, we meet a different kind of ceremony. In 2020, a small company called LexiData secured seed funding to develop a knowledge graph for the pharmaceutical supply chain. Their goal was to integrate data from manufacturers, distributors, regulators, and hospitals into a coherent ontology that could answer questions like, which batch of a drug is at risk of contamination? By mapping each entity, raw material, production line, shipping container, as a node with defined relationships, LexiData enabled automated reasoning that flagged anomalies before they became crises. The founders often spoke of semantic glue that binds disparate data silos. In a pitch deck, they quoted Tim Berners-Lee, "The web is for everyone. The semantic web is for machines." Their ambition was to give machines the capacity to understand the world in a way that humans have traditionally reserved for themselves. But the very act of imposing a formal ontology on a messy, socially embedded supply chain raises questions. Who decides which properties are essential, whose categories are privileged? Critics from post-colonial studies argue that such ontologies can perpetuate a form of epistemic colonialism, where the knowledge structures of powerful corporations overwrite local practices and indigenous knowledge. As Annabel Quijano reminds us, the coloniality of power continues to shape the ways we classify and value knowledge. In the LexiData case, the ontology might prioritize regulatory compliance over community health practices, thereby shaping the very reality of pharmaceutical distribution. These tensions echo the broader philosophical debate about the role of ontology in practice. Is ontology a neutral scaffolding, a descriptive map that merely reflects pre-existing reality? Or is it an active force that constructs reality by delineating what counts as a thing, by assigning identities, by prescribing relations? The relational ontologies of quantum physics suggest the latter. The act of measurement, the act of interaction, brings forth properties that did not exist in isolation. The digital twin shows how a virtual model can influence the behavior of its physical counterpart. By predicting a failure, the twin can trigger maintenance that prevents the failure, thereby altering the system's trajectory. The environmental ontology of a river can lead to policy changes that restore floodplains, reshaping the river's flow and the surrounding community. To deepen our understanding, let us explore two analogies that illuminate the nature of contemporary ontologies. First, imagine a library. In the traditional sense, a library is a collection of books, physical.